got Zoom fired up, so we're gonna get started. All right, okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, both in person and for our Zoom audience. We appreciate you coming all the way up here to Brookings for this event. Happy to be here to talk about ACES. I've got Darla Beal from Brookings County Youth Mentoring Program, Nikki Eining with Vera Behavioral Health, and Terry Liggins as well with, how do I say it, Hurdle Life Coaching. So we're gonna get the event started here. We have everything going both in person and via Zoom. Please feel free to use the chat if you've got any questions. And as far as the actual event itself goes, please let us know if you're having any audio or video issues. We'll do everything we can to sort that out if we're having Zoom problems, but we've got some redundancies built in, so I think we're all set. So with that said, I will turn it over to our speakers here today. Thank you.
Really nervous. I feel like you're excited to have us here.
I love it. Well, Terry and I, we want to get the games done with her, so maybe that'll be very fun. Mixer after. And I also wanted to add, if you're not familiar with this location, the bathrooms are just through that exit hallway if you need to utilize those. But I know Tony's recording, so if there are individuals that aren't able to be here today, we can get them access to today's information, but we're really excited for you guys to all be here. And coming alongside us when we talk about this call to action of helping protect all the potential of our individuals and families throughout South Dakota. So we're excited to have you guys here. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the ACES study. So ACES stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. We're going to talk a little bit about how do ACES impact our neurobiology development. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how do we build resiliency and protective factors for our individuals and families that we serve. So when we look at building self-healing communities, again, what we're trying to talk a little bit about today is all of us have a role to play with every individual, every family that we're working with. We can help build some safety, some protective factors to protect their potential. And we want to really reframe towards this holistic approach for child and family well-being. So when we talk about this, what we're going to kind of help try to shift today is all of those individuals that we're working with, when we're working with them one-on-one, or maybe we're working with the family system, really challenging our mindset of what's wrong with you or what's your problem to what happened to you and why is this perception of the situation kind of difficult for you. So we talk about that mind shift because adverse childhood experiences are a preventable thing. We can prevent them, we can work to provide solutions for them, and they are a public issue. So again, thanks for being here with us today. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm going to come around on the resilience piece. Nikki's going to do neuroscience and the impact on the brain, and Darla's going to do ACES. But for those who are unfamiliar with myself, because I'm new to this community, I just figured I'd do just a short introduction about who I am and why I'm here. So as the founder at the Hurdle Life Coach, we do education, coaching, and mentorship services, primarily within the justice system. So those who are justice impacted is where we really find our niche of having that expertise. That comes through first and foremost of being a credible messenger, being a person who has been impacted by the system as a juvenile and as an adult. So I stand before you 5 years from my release as an adult. Also, my first interaction being in diversion as like a 13 or 14-year-old back in Omaha, Nebraska, in Douglas County. But I also have a bachelor's degree in criminal justice and a master's in public administration. And so there's just this hodgepodge of life experiences that I've been able to bring into what is called the Hurdle Life Coach and provide that type of support there in Sioux Falls, and then be an advocate for this type of education across the state. So I am a part of South Dakota ACES and Resiliency Fellowship as a master trainer, which basically means I was one of the first 26 professionals that was trained by Dr. Ander when he came out here 3 years ago. So when he came out here with Dr. Laurel Porter, there was a process to apply to become a presenter for understanding ACES and resilience. So I was a part of that initial 26 back in 2018. Since then, we've trained over 10, 11, 12, 13,000 people, and we continue to find there's still people who haven't heard understanding ACEs, and then also really the science of resilience.
I will say, I got an email that we're almost to 16,000.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, I'm changing my 15,000+. We're getting there. And so, but we're also committed to just sharing this information and finding others who want to pay it forward. And that's where we get Nikki's and Darla's and others to continue to take it into their communities, to bring it out that it's not just having a familiarity with the term ACEs, it's understanding ACEs. And the only way you're going to do that is by having presentations like this where we peel back the onion and really get into the weeds of some of that. And so I'm here as a master trainer as well to just observe and to help and to teach and stuff, but also to contribute. And I'm honored to be here because Brookings is doing amazing work. Brookings has been lifted up for its efforts already. And so this is just another example of Brookings heading in the right direction. And we're here to support that and bring some more momentum to it. So thanks for having me. I look forward to talking resilience later.
I appreciate you for talking a little bit about that. So thank you. You'll hear a lot of different perspectives. We each kind of hit different sectors. So myself, being in mental health, working specifically with youth and adolescents, like Terry said, a lot of the peer mentoring stuff, his story, and Darla with her mentoring program, you'll hear a little bit of some specific stories that we have. But we want to get started by talking a little bit of that neurobiology piece. And so the important thing that we really want to help everyone understand is from the moment that we are born, we start storing information in our nervous system. So all the memories, the experiences that we have from infancy across the lifespan, we start to store those in our nervous system. And that's what helps kind of create those perception in those environments. So good and bad, you'll hear us talk a little bit about we're conditioned of some of those perceptions in different environments. And so when we talk about the nervous system, a little science for us today, that nervous system is our brain, our spinal cord, those peripheral nerves, all of that creates opportunities for us to connect with the world around us. So we take in that information in our nervous system, we process it really quickly, and that helps us create that perception of what to do in those situations. So our nervous system regulates our body functions. It sends us those messagings about what to do in that situation. And it instantly makes decisions about those relationships, about the environments, about the situations around us. So when we talk about brain development, you'll see at birth, our wiring starting to form. We kind of have in the human development world, we have a phrase, what fires together wires together. So the more things are firing together, you'll start to see, like at that elementary age, how we see those neural pathways. So the more specific pathways are fired together, they will wire together. And so then at puberty, we start to see some of the pruning that occurs. So again, when we talk about all of our different experiences, if I'm at birth and I'm experiencing some of those neglect situations, and that's the pathways that are forming consistently, that's what's going to wire together, is that pathway that is telling my nervous system that's my experience. If I'm experiencing kindness and that feedback from my adults around me, my daycare provider, maybe my family, if I'm receiving those, what we call return and serve connections, where I'm making eye contact or reaching out in some way, I'm getting that back. That's what's going to fire together and wire together. So those experiences at birth, those experiences at elementary age, we see those are those pathways being created. I will say, sometimes when we talk a little bit about this, people kind of walk away or they ask, well, then what's kind of the point? If this is what's wired together, and what's kind of the point of what we can do? And the most important thing is to continue to remember that across the lifespan, there are tons of opportunities to rewire neural pathways. So there are things that we can do to help rewire those neurobiological components. So this is not our destiny. We can help keep rewiring for individuals. So when we talk about these different worlds, we can see when we're met with mean, dangerous experiences, right? We start to form that wiring for that fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. So we can see those stress responses occurring. So you'll hear me use that terminology a little bit, that stress response. That's what we call that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. Some people, when I say fawn, they're like, what's that? And those are kind of our yes people. So when I'm in situations that are dangerous, or maybe my survival skill has become, if I say yes, if I people please to try to prevent maybe the physical abuse or the situation that's occurring, we see some of that fawn behavior happening. So being in those dangerous situations, we can see that hardwiring where those trauma stress responses occur. We see we're able to survive those worst conditions, but what happens is we're releasing more of those cortisol chemicals into our body. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on with the neurobiology, but what we're doing is we're creating these patterns in our nervous system and our behavior that's helping us adapt and survive. On that bottom part, you'll see when we're met with kindness, when we're met with safety, when we're met with generosity, right? We're able to trust relationships or trust people. We're able to believe in our own success. We're able to be flexible, all of those components that are a result of those safe environments. And so we have to continue to remember just some of those different pathways that we can see from those beginning experiences. Terry, I know this is your slide, so if I'm missing something, you got to jump in.
You read my mind. I was just gonna say, may I?
This is his bread and butter.
I was just gonna ask though too. I was gonna, may I jump in here for a second here? So the top path is called malevolent, the malevolent world path, and the bottom is called the benevolent world path. And what's important to know here is that a child doesn't choose the life path that they're born into. And what's also important to know is that the brain works the way the brain is supposed to work. So no matter which condition a child is born into, the brain is going to adapt to those environments, the necessary behaviors, beliefs, and mindsets that are necessary for that survival in that environment that they did not choose. So when we start looking at understanding ACEs and start talking about this conversation, and well, how does these adverse childhood experiences, how do these conditions play into the neurobiology of things and ultimately behaviors and outcomes? This is where we start to find the compassion and say, well, they didn't choose that environment, and the brain, why, the way it works, they adapted what they were supposed to survive in that environment. So here's where I give an example of my own experience. At the age of 6 years old, I survived my first drive-by shooting. I'm out in the front yard in Omaha, Nebraska, in the project. You know, my mother is a mother of 6 children, single mother of 6. I'm in the front yard and we're playing, and a person comes through on a bicycle and starts shooting off an Uzi, an automatic weapon. Automatic weapon fires out. This part of Omaha was called Vietnam, is what they called it, because that's how violent things could get at times. But when that happened, I did what my brain told me to do: 3 things: fight, flight, or freeze, and I ran. But when I look back, my little sister, 2 years old, she froze. So that's what happens whenever you are threatened, whenever you are challenged. You're either gonna fight, flight, or you're gonna freeze. I ran, my sister froze, and I ran back out into the gunfire and grabbed my sister and brought her to safety. That happened to me at 6 years old. That was a normal occurrence in my neighborhood. That was my first drive-by shooting. So what type of mannerism am I going to develop to survive those types of environments? And it was so fascinating to me because when I was 30 years old and someone asked me about if I knew what trauma was, I didn't. And I didn't know that experience was actually an adverse childhood experience. And that experience actually, it doesn't register in our ACE foundational, because the ACE score has to do with household dysfunction, and that's a neighborhood dysfunction or neighborhood violence, but that's still adversity and stress. So then we even know that this compounds when we start talking about adversity. So those type of environments in neighborhood or in the home, Darla's going to talk more about what the other ACEs are, but what's important to know is that children don't choose those environments. So now when you're working with an adult who maybe was born into a malevolent environment, you can have a little more compassion in that interaction. The other side is benevolent. Nikki talked about some of the benefits of that, being able to process, being able to handle options. If you grew up in an environment where you don't have a lot of time to decide and you're not good at making decisions, you're just good at reacting, and that's what you needed to do in that environment to survive. So as we are working with adults, youth, we got to understand that they don't choose those pathways, and that brain is going to do those adaptations to survive those pathways. So when we see behavior, we never think there's something wrong. Our question and curiosity is, what has happened?
Perfect. Because that sets us up for when we talk about this adaptations for expectations versus expectations. So like Terry said, we have to be mindful of the reality that kids, adults that we're working with haven't chosen their experiences throughout their childhood. And so their brain, their nervous system is constantly adapting for survival. They're constantly adapting to support them through those experiences. And so what happens is they go out into these environments, whether it's school or after school programming or sports or musical environments, neighborhoods, all these components. And there are these social expectations that we have for them, right? Do the testing, do the work, all these expectations that as a society we have on them. And so what's tough is sometimes those survival components kick in and they're not able to adhere to some of those expectations. And so again, what we're trying to think about is shifting what's wrong with you, why aren't you taking this test right now, to what happened to you and how do I help this situation be a little bit more comfortable or safe for you so we can try to work together to help you reach your potential in this situation. So a story I like to tell, a couple of stories I like to share for examples of this is an adolescent I worked with in a different community. Mom died by suicide. She had gone to school. It was an annual anniversary of her mother's death. They were testing at school that day, and because of obviously a lot of thoughts she had going on in her brain, she threw the iPad, said, F this, I'm not doing this, got up and ran out of the classroom. And so when we try to really challenge ourselves to have that compassion, to think from that perspective of what has this child experienced versus, well, you're not being compliant and taking the test. We meet that individual where they're at and try to come alongside them to support them through that adaptation behavior. And so talking with her, in that moment, she was actually experiencing thoughts of, I just want to die and be with my mom. I'm done with this. I don't want to be here anymore. I just want to be with my mom. When we don't come to those scenarios or those situations with outlooks like that, it's really difficult to understand what has happened to them, that their perception or their experience is difficult or rough for them right now, and they're struggling to meet that expectation. Okay, so she wasn't able to meet that expectation. Another example that I like to talk about is I had a 61-year-old female that I had worked with for a couple of years, extensive compound childhood trauma history. She was 4 years old, walked in to a basement room and found her father trying to hang himself, and actually was the one who ran up and pulled on him hard enough that she was able to get him down from there and save his life at age of 4. So 61, we were working together. That was actually not why we had started working together, but what had happened was her daughter had said, oh, Mom, I'm really excited to show you your childhood home is up for sale. Wouldn't it be fun for us to look through the pictures since it's been so long? And so looking through those photos online, she actually looked at the photos of the basement, had not had stress responses from that scenario, but then in that moment started to have those stress responses. Those PTSD components come up for her. She's back in that situation. And it was difficult for her to show up for work for the next probably 2 weeks while we worked through that trigger of that trauma history. So when we talk about those expectations, right, that expectation of showing up to work, and that was difficult for her because of that compound childhood trauma and what had been triggered in that situation. So it's just that constant awareness of those survival skills, those adaptation skills. They can make it difficult at times to meet those societal expectations.
Nikki, thank you for that part of that story. One thing I'll ask you to start thinking about when you're hearing people talk, because everyone's heard of PTSD, right? You hear that all the time. But now this is getting an understanding. So now understand what a trigger does and what a trigger is. Well-intentioned, well-intended. Show the picture of a basement, trigger. And all of a sudden she's back into a place and memories are stored. Just like if you smell something right now, that might take you right back to a memory of grandma's kitchen. And there's all type of things that becomes triggers for people with trauma history. Something to be thinking about now, and as you're navigating spaces with people, what could be a trigger? And how can I be trauma sensitive? How can I be trauma informed? How can I be aware?
Because biology will win every time, right? Until, we really help come alongside them, because we say that, but there is hope that we can help, get individuals the trauma treatment they need, help teach skills, right? Help provide supports for them to not be alone in that. There's a lot of things that Terry will talk about in that resilient component that, yes, biology will win every time, but we can provide concrete supports to help with some of that rewiring, to help build some of those concrete supports that can support them in meeting those expectations. So we talk about also, the effects of maltreatment. That's different depending upon gender, age when the maltreatment happens, the type of maltreatment that happens. But again, we want to continue to reiterate, we can work together to try to prevent compound trauma. So especially for you guys, when you're able to intervene, if there are opportunities for us to prevent compound trauma, that can be really monumental for individuals that we work with. And also everyone takes in trauma differently. So we talk about these components today, but we want to make sure to highlight, based off of gender, age when it happens, the type of trauma, if it's a repeated trauma, right, that compound trauma, that can affect that neurobiology impact differently. And there are sensitive periods throughout our development. So when we talk about, that elementary age where we start to look at that hard wiring, when we talk about adolescence, when we talk about pruning, adolescence is also a component where we start to look at forming that identity. So there are lots of periods across the lifespan where not only is it impactful when that trauma occurs, it's also impactful if there are concrete supports available during those components across our development also. So a lot of those sensitive periods of our development are affected by our experiences. So how can we continue to be aware of what experiences have occurred or are occurring for them? And how can we provide some concrete support experiences for them as well? So when we talk about the limbic system, that's really this component that regulates our hormones, but we really see that stress response occur. So the play therapist in me likes to teach everybody our fist brain. So when we talk about our limbic system, that happens to be our thumb and our fist brain, but this is our frontal cortex. So when we talk about our frontal cortex, that's what helps be in the driver's seat of my car, right? It helps me make good decisions. I'm steering the right way where I need to go. I'm following the directions where I need to go. And inside is that limbic system portion of our brain. So like Terry was alluding to, when we have some of those triggers, my frontal cortex flips, so we call it kind of flipping our lid, and my limbic system takes over. So something that I have perceived gives me a perception of danger, a perception that I'm not safe, that frontal cortex flips, and then I can no longer be in that steering component where I'm able to process information, problem solve, follow the directions, steer my car where it needs to go. I'm functioning from that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And so we talk a little bit about how, I see Terry shift, like maybe you wanted to add something. So we talk about how that's vital for relationships, right? So if I'm in those situations and I quickly, like we talked about, in seconds, my nervous system makes that decision, is this person safe? So that's vital when we walk into those scenarios. How can I provide this perception of safety? Because we know the amygdala, that hippocampus, helps us decipher about those relationships in our situations. It also is what releases that cortisol into our system. So when we talk about cortisol and epinephrine, that's what creates adrenaline. So when we talk about fight, flight, freeze responses, it's because our body, our nervous system has been flooded with adrenaline, and we act quickly in those situations to survive. When we talk about different forms of maltreatment at specific ages across the lifespan, what's important to remember is when we think about that release of the cortisol, when we think about that release of the epinephrine at specific ages across our development, it has an impact for delayed development. So I like to really reiterate, there's a difference between biological age and developmental age. So when we know that individuals have experienced forms of maltreatment, especially compound childhood maltreatment at different ages, they might biologically be 17 in front of us, but developmentally, they could be functioning at that age of when the trauma occurred. So we can see those effects from when the trauma occurred much later on then, right? So if I'm 17 biologically, but I've experienced trauma at age 3, those effects are happening later on in those years, and we're seeing those developmental components of maybe a 3, a 4, or 5-year-old. So it's really important for us to have that mindset that I might be with somebody that's a biological age of this, but they could be functioning from a developmental age younger when they experience that trauma.
And that also applies for adults. I know we talk about juveniles, but oftentimes we don't realize that when we're working with adults as well. It could be 35 years old, and it's at a 17 developmental. That's huge.
No. We also want to talk about, this portion of neurobiology because when we talk about those developmental stages, right, they impact our attention, our ability to pay attention, they impact our ability to problem solve, they impact our mental health. So when we talk about components like the cerebellar vermis not developing where it should, if it's underdeveloped, that's when we start to see, when we talk about like, well, I'm biologically with this age person, but they're functioning developmentally here because of these underdeveloped components of their brain. So being able to navigate, like we said, being able to perceive situations accurately, that's because of underdeveloped neurobiology.
I know she's going to continue to go into the brain on this, but this is the part that really equalizes the conversation across all people, is this brain stuff. So a lot of times people haven't heard of these terms, like amygdala and hippocampus, right? Like when we learn about the central nervous system in middle school, yeah, we learn about the brain and the spinal cord, but we don't, then you go on and you get into your field of study and it's not common anymore to think about the parts of the brain, the top, the middle, the bottom, and the amygdala and the hippocampus. So I like to help common the language. And so say amygdala with me, amygdala.
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 The hippocampus.
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 Right, that's the gas and brake. This is the thing that's triggering people when they're walking in, that amygdala is going off and saying, I'm not safe here. But if you can't hit a target you don't see. So if you don't even know what an amygdala is, you're not going to be even trying to be trauma sensitive to not trigger someone's amygdala. So this is the part of getting this understanding of ACEs in our work when we start thinking about that. The cerebellar vermis, they often say, is the seat of addiction and mental illness. A part of it in the cerebellar vermis has to do with your pleasure center. So when we're talking about adversity and how stress disrupts development in the amygdala, the hippocampus, the cerebellar vermis, the corpus callosum is coming next. If there's a disruption in the cerebellar vermis, which controls pleasure, so a person can't access their natural biological pleasure, what do they do to try to remedy that? Substance use. Other behaviors that are going to help remedy what was disrupted from the stress that they didn't choose. So when we're seeing people who are struggling with substance use and et cetera and so forth, it's more than just, I have a desire to have an early death or an early, I just want to risk going to prison and jail. There's so much more going on in their brain that they're trying to cope with from experiences that now when we are mindful of that, we engage in different ways.
So Terry read my brain,
Nice.
because that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, is that awareness of that reward system. So when this is underdeveloped, we don't release as much dopamine as our system needs to experience those positive feelings. And so like Terry's saying, when we utilize substances, what happens is we hardwire a neural pathway to our reward center and we release dopamine. So we can see that not only through substance use, but we also see that through social media use. So one of the key components that we talk about with dopamine release is individuals who not only become addicted to substances, but become addicted to screen use, to social media use, because research has been linked to, or research shows that when we get likes or when we get specific comments on our social media feeds, that also releases small amounts of dopamine into our system. So we talk about, just like Terry's saying, when these underdeveloped components of the brain are there, we're not able to naturally release some of that dopamine that individuals who are born and raised in a safe world, we start to see some of these more at-risk behaviors. So then we talk a little bit about our cerebellar vermis. And again, when we talk about some of those delayed components, what we really want to be aware of with this one is we have a predisposition for mental health disorders. So there's a reality that some of us are born with a family predisposition for severe mental health disorders, and then this just impacts that even more. So not only with the underdeveloped component associated with the cerebellar vermis, when we talk about maybe that predisposition for addiction, this part, the cerebellar vermis, we also talk about that predisposition for mental health. And so talking about the corpus callosum, what we want to keep in mind with an underdeveloped portion of our brain when it comes to that is we're not able to develop complex thought. So that's one that I really like to point out when we talk about able to process information associated with facial perception. That's a big one that I hear from individuals that I work with who've been impacted by trauma, right? That nervous system takes in that information. We make a decision so quickly. When we're not able to process facial perception adequately because of that underdeveloped portion of our brain, we might be perceiving those nonverbals from somebody a little differently. So we do a lot of work in my office about like nonverbals. What are nonverbal cues? What does that look like if people are making specific facial cues? We're not able to process information if we have an underdeveloped component as well as if it was fully developed. So again, we want to continue to be mindful that there are a lot of different impacts based off of age, based off of gender. But we want to continue to remember that it does have that impact on brain development, and it can decrease the brain communication from not only both of our hemispheres of our brain, but when we talk about like what we call interoception, so that sensory related information. So we'll talk a lot about, I work with kids, so I like to use those examples, but we'll see kids, adults who can't even kind of have that information of I need to use the bathroom. Like this is the sense, this is the communication from my nervous system that I need to utilize the restroom. Or this is my information from my nervous system that I'm having a specific feeling, or that I'm hungry. You know, a lot of those sensory related information components that are easy for some of us, that gets disrupted, and that's not easy for individuals who've been impacted by trauma and their neurodevelopment has been impacted. It's also where we see, again, with addiction, different components happening, because if I can't understand some of that sensory related information, I will seek different sensory inputs in order to either get rid of that sensation or give myself a specific sensation. So we talk about when that interoception has been disrupted, we can see a lot of those addiction components too, to try to mask some of those senses or input senses. We also see, sometimes I'll hear people say, well, that individual should have just been able to calm down, right? So somebody walks into your office, maybe they're yelling, they're very agitated, they're very dysregulated, and it's easy for us to say, well, you need to calm down. So this is an example when we talk about disrupted neurobiology, they don't have the skills to be able to just calm down in that situation. Their nervous system is reacting to something. We probably have no idea what it is, but that nervous system is reacting to a scenario in where their perception is something's unsafe, and they're not in control. They're not in that steering, right? They don't have that executive functioning going. They're functioning from that amygdala portion of their brain. So when we find ourselves saying like, we just need to calm down, that's really difficult. How do we help maybe bring those skills or help create that feeling of safety in that moment to support them in being able to do that? So again, what we want to try to remember is even small things can trigger that stress response. So kind of like Terry talked about too, right? Like our room color is green. Maybe something happened to me in a green room. So just something that small can trigger my nervous system to respond in that situation. So the more that we just are mindful that small amounts of stress can trigger those traumatic responses, we can try to learn more from that individual that we're working with about what's going on, what happened, and how do we support you in feeling safe right now. So again, just being mindful of when we talk about that underdeveloped brain or that disrupted neurobiology, we have to continue to remember those expectations are difficult at times for individuals, especially those executive skills, those complex thinking skills. So that emotional control, sustained attention, task initiation, organizing, time management, goal-directed persistence, metacognition, those can all be difficult. I say that, I don't want to be like, oh, here's the bad news and just walk away, right? Because again, we continue to remember there's hope that all of us being able to provide concrete support or referring to, trauma-based interventions, we can make this different. This doesn't have to be everybody's story, and Terry will talk a lot more about that later. And so we have this opportunity together to be able to intervene, to be able to protect individuals' potential by supporting their capability and helping provide those concrete supports to come alongside and help with rewiring, help prevent compound trauma. Another component that we talk a lot about is epigenetics. So this concept of historical trauma. So there is a lot of research that has come out over the last 20 years that shows us it takes 3 generational cycles to prevent DNA stored components associated with trauma. So gene expressions associated with childhood maltreatment can be inherited. So one of the studies that I'd like to talk a little bit about, there was a study that happened where they would introduce cherry blossoms to the male mice, and then they would provide some type of like pinch, where it was physical enough that there was a reaction for that male mouse. So introducing the cherry blossom, and then there was a physical harm to that male mouse. So the male mice, the women mice would then conceive, have little mice babies, but then thank you, would have pups, and then cherry blossoms would be introduced to the pups, and the pups would have a traumatic response. So when we talk about epigenetics, it's important for us to remember working with individuals, family traumatic genetic history is real. Generational trauma is real. However, again, we can help change the story for families. We can help change the stories for individuals. So just because epigenetics is real, because disruptive neurobiology has an intense impact, does not mean that's the end of the story for the individuals we're working with. And so Terry will be your leader in talking about how we help protect everyone's potential.
You said a piece about that epigenetic piece where, so an example to think about with epigenetics, you talk about cherry blossom and mice. I'll just be candid for time. Native Americans, they inherit a distrust for white people. So if you're getting offended that a Native American person doesn't trust you and you're a white person, you're not being cognizant of epigenetics and the role that it may play in that distrust, that inherited distrust. Similarly, so with African Americans and law enforcement officers. It has taken me a long time. It's taken me a lot of work to not be triggered when I see a law enforcement officer. That's recent resilience. But if you have a child who just, you see a cop, they see a cop and they don't get excited and you think something's wrong with them, you're not being cognizant of the historical relevance of the history of law enforcement, African Americans or whites with Native Americans, and how that through epigenetics is inherited and by biology a part of their response.
Thank you, Terry. So we're going to shift a little bit, and my name is Darla Beal. I'm Executive Director of the Brookings County Youth Mentoring Program, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the study that was started in the early 90s and is actually continuing today. It's one of the largest longitudinal studies of its kind. I also just want to say that I came to this work and became passionate about it because what I'm seeing in my program is that often when I read about things in the paper or I hear about things at the Brookings County Child Protection Team, if they involve children, they often involve mentees, right, who are in my program. So that includes like a mother who was manufacturing and distributing meth, the house blew up, that was a mentee. Talking about family violence, household violence that ended in an actual death of an individual recently, that involved 2 of the mentees in the room when that occurred. So that's why I'm passionate about this work. It's why all of our mentees take a similar training to this. It's associated or specifically geared toward mentoring, and how do those mentors engage with people in a trauma-informed way. So I'm very, very happy to be here and happy to be presenting with these skilled presenters, Terry and Nikki. So I'm going to tell you, like I said, a little bit more about the ACE study, and Nikki did a great job leading us through the neurobiology, but now we're going to talk about ACES and epidemiology, how when individuals in a population are experiencing adversity, and that impacts their brains. What does that look like throughout a population as a whole? So the original ACE studies was in 1990 or the early 90s, and it involved Dr. Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti. Dr. Anda was a senior scientist at the CDC in Atlanta, and he was looking at depression and smoking, like how are those two related? Dr. Vincent Folletti was working in San Diego at Kaiser Permanente, which is a managed care consortium. And he was interested in childhood sexual abuse and how that was a predictor or correlated with morbid obesity. So the two of them were kind of looking at how do these health behaviors, these risk behaviors, how are they impacted by early adversity? And could it be that there's some wiring that happens in the brain that is going to increase your likelihood of engaging in risky behaviors? At the same time, in the 90s, that's when there was a lot of public health campaigns about the risks of smoking, about HIV awareness, how that was spread, and yet they found that there's still people engaging in risky behaviors, even though they knew it. They knew what the risks were, they continued to smoke. They knew what the risks were, they continued to use intravenous drugs. And so the question became, are some health conditions a defense against unwanted experiences? This slide, does the risk for chronic health problems originate in childhood? Okay. And so when Drs. Anda and Folletti met and started, they clicked. And so they really started wanting to develop a study that looked at diversity. Are you coming for me, Terry?
I am not.
Okay. And sort of looked at adversity and looking at large scale public health problems and wondering if there was some correlations. Because if we can know about the root causes of some of these large public health problems, then we can prevent. So knowledge is prevention. Right? And so they developed a study, and I'm going to lead you through some of the original findings of that study. And then just keep in mind, though, that it's ongoing. It's been studied since 1995 and still today. And it's also been expanded, like Terry alluded to. The original ACE study did include things like community violence. So there are studies now that look at community violence as a stressor. There are studies that add poverty to it. But I'm going to talk about just the original ACE study. And so the hypothesis that Drs. Anda and Folletti came up with, they knew a lot about health risks, those top 3 tiers. This is a lifespan, kind of looking at a life course model. And so a lot was known about the early, or the top 3, right? We knew that health risks and behaviors are going to increase the likelihood of disease, disability, and social problems, which will result in early death. But they didn't have a lot of understanding or knowledge about the base of that pyramid. And so Drs. Anda and Folletti, they theorized and hypothesized as part of their scientific study that if there's historical trauma and intergenerational adversity, that's going to cause these adverse childhood experiences, which is going to impact the way that individual functions socially, emotionally, and cognitively, and that those impacted behavior or impacted functioning is going to increase the likelihood of those health risks and behaviors. So they were theorizing this bottom part of the pyramid, again, because thinking if they could prevent some of those things, or if they knew about those, and they could prevent. If it's predictable, then it's preventable.
Perfect. Thank
Yep.
you. So a part of the thing about here too is we get a lot of our efforts are health risk and behavior mitigation, consequence based. If you see truancy, or if you see crime, if you see drug use, that's all health risk and behavior. And if your system or if your protocols and your operation is only mitigating health risk and behavior, then you're missing this opportunity to go further down in this pyramid to deal with something that has a broader impact on health risk and behavior. So this pyramid and other data you're going to see after this is what drives the passion to talk about ACEs. Because it's at the base of it. It contributes to the health risk, it contributes to the crime rate, it contributes to drug use, it contributes to truancy. We want the efforts and we want the focus on those things, but we have an opportunity to go further down into the base and start realizing how collectively understanding ACEs will help us to deal with the other issues.
And so this slide is just showing the same, but it's just to point out that when Dr. Zanda and Folletti theorized this, they didn't have all the new neuroscientific studies and the research that we have now. And so this slide shows that even though they were theorizing this back in the early 90s, it's been proven to be a biologically sound hypothesis. Like Nikki talked about, it does impact, adversity does impact neurodevelopment. And even going back farther to pre-birth, there are studies that it impacts the epigenetics, like the gene expression of parents. And so it does impact neurodevelopment. The neurodevelopment does cause individuals or contribute to individuals' adaptations. And some of those adaptations might lead to engage in risk behaviors, even though they know about it. If you know about it, why can't you fix it, right? This is kind of go into that a little bit more. Okay, the other thing that was unique about this study was that they began to look at multiple adversities and multiple childhood stressors. Earlier studies often would just look at one thing, right? One childhood stressor. How does childhood sexual abuse contribute to obesity, for example? And so Dr. Anda and Folletti in this ACE studies are looking at how do these multiple stressors interact. Now, I'm going to tell you about the study. An interesting thing to note is that it was CDC and Kaiser Permanente, which was a managed health consortium. So 17,000, mostly white, mostly middle class individuals took a survey. More educated, more college educated than the general American population at the time. They took this through Kaiser Permanente, so they had health insurance, they had access to good preventive care. And so we're going to go a little bit, just kind of, I'm going to keep reminding you of that. Who is this population? And start to have you consider, if this is true of 17,000 highly educated or mostly educated middle class individuals who have health care, what does that look like with other populations? Okay, so in that original studies, this is some hard information that I'm going to be going through, but the other thing to always keep in mind too is what Nikki talked about, the neuroplasticity of the brain. We know now that, you know, if this happened to you in childhood, it's not the end of the story necessarily. So they found in this study that household or that adverse childhood experiences are common. They divided them into 3 categories of household dysfunction, which included like substance abuse, parental separation or divorce, having an individual with a mental illness, not necessarily them, but just having someone with mental illness in the household, witnessing violence in the home, particularly battered mothers, is what the ACE study looked at, and then criminal behavior in the home. The second large category was neglect, whether that was emotional or physical neglect, and the third was abuse, emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. In those 17,000 highly educated, you know, individuals, they found that ACEs were common. So the percentages are what you see as they found in that original study. 27%. You know, substance abuse. That kind of blows my mind. It's high. It's higher than you would expect because we have individuals in our society walking around. You don't see this, right? You don't see everything that people may have experienced when they were children, but it's there. It's challenging to face that reality. The other thing that the study found is that ACEs are highly interrelated, and if you think about the individuals you work with, and when I think about the families and the children that I often work with in the mentoring program, this makes a lot of sense. But they found in the study that where there's one ACE present, there's an 87% chance that there's also a second type of adverse childhood experience going on. It just makes sense. If you have somebody in your home with a parent with substance abuse, the likelihood that there's going to be some violence in the home is going to go up, right? Or the likelihood that there's going to be some sort of neglect it just makes sense. But they discovered it, or they were able to prove it in this ACE study. Again, what is predictable is preventable. And so we can predict some of these things, but that also gives us opportunity to intervene, to do what we can to collectively and individually to protect that potential of those individuals. Okay. There's an implication, right, that we have to intersect our efforts. So what this slide shows you that on the right-hand side, it says the frequency of witnessing violence against the mothers. So it goes from light to dark, the darker one being the most frequently that you've witnessed violence in the home against the mother, and then victimization, right? So far side is emotional abuse. If you have witnessed violence against your mother, very often you're much more likely to yourself be a victim of emotional abuse. Physical abuse the same, sexual abuse the same, they correlate. So I was really glad to read the story in the Register recently, right? Because again, what is predictable is preventable. When we're preventing adversity in the home and violence in the home, we're also preventing the likelihood of those children to be abused. Okay, this just shows that when they, in that study, this was the frequency, and they wanted to like have a number, right, to see what the sort of the biologic dose was of stress and traumatic stress. And so in those original 10 ACEs, they said, no matter how often you've experienced it, or no matter the severity at which you've experienced it, if you've experienced it once, you have an ACE score of 1, right? If you've experienced 2 of them, it's 2, 3, 2. And so it's important to remember, like, even separation, right? So separation and divorce is 1, but even if there was separation of the parents, that's 1. So no matter the times or the severity. And so they found 33% of those individuals, so 17,000 educated, middle class people with healthcare, 33% had 0, 26 had 1, 16% had 2, another 16% had 4+, and 10% had 3. There are studies, and I won't go into them now, but you can look. Child trends is one that kind of goes state by state, and we'll talk about the individuals in the state, in the region that have ACE scores. That's a little bit expanded. It also looks at poverty, and the original one didn't look at poverty. But there are statistics, if you're interested in it, you can find it. What does that look like in South Dakota compared to what it looks like in the country?
And we'll say too, in Brookings, we have the luxury of our high school and our middle school doing the Search Institute survey for 20+ years. And so the Search Institute survey asks specific questions about different types of childhood maltreatment. So for example, have you experienced physical abuse in the last 30 days that has left a bruise? And what we've seen is our local statistics fit these national statistics. So when we're talking about local children and individuals impacted by forms of maltreatment, it is the same that we are finding from that Search Institute data.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I'll add a point here to think about. Y'all is doing such a great job of talking about that original population sample size, how those numbers distort in different demographics. When you see something like 6% of that household dealt with criminal behavior, is that going to be the same number when we're dealing with other demographics like our African Americans or our Native Americans? Is that going to be much higher? Is that going to be much higher?
Yeah.
It's going to be much higher, right? Saying similarly so with that battered mother statistic. Unfortunate, this is unfortunate, it hurts and it should hurt. But we've got to face it. Nothing changes, not everything you face changes, but nothing will change until you face it. And we've got to be honest about what we're dealing with in South Dakota, and knowing that if this original study shook people to the core, and then we've got exacerbated numbers in our state, then we've got to keep rattling our systems as well to take a look at this. And when you look at this thing, it says 33% have zero. That means 67% have at least one. That's over half. So acknowledging that ACEs are very common. And if we as a community, and if you as a leader and in your organization, you're not having a conversation about ACEs and how are you being trauma informed, you're likely, it's an injustice, is what I call it in my education. It's an injustice. There's people in your workplace, in this community, living with ACEs, and we aren't equipped and informed to be trauma responsive to those conditions. 67% mean at least have one. It's over half. That's why we're so fervent in bringing this in any wall, any place where there's a heartbeat in the brain. We're going to have a conversation about ACEs because they're that common. 67% has at least one.
Thank you, Terry. And remember the slide, if 67% have at least one, then 87% of those have at least two. Right? They cluster together. Also, just keep in mind that these ACE studies and studies in trauma have been expanded to include things like poverty, bullying, racism, living in foster care, community violence. So we're only looking at household dysfunction, abuse, and what's the other one? Neglect. Yeah, thank you. Okay, but the power of people to come together, right, to rally around and to support and to protect the potential of all individuals. The brain is not a static thing, right? There's neuroplasticity and there's power in people coming together to support. Okay, so this slide just shows, going back to that dose or that biologic dose of stressors, it just shows that if you look at the percent of the individuals with health problems in general, and then you correlate that to the dose of adverse childhood experiences they had, remember that doesn't have to be the severity of it, right, or the frequency of it, but just if they've experienced it. But there is a correlation between the dose and with percentage of people reporting health problems in general. Let's think back to that pyramid, right? Adversity, you're going to have those social emotional adaptations, those neurological adaptations. It's going to increase your risk behaviors, and then disease and early death. So this just showed that really was a pyramid, that their hypothesis was accurate. Okay, we're gonna oops. Did I go too far? Okay. Sorry, I thought I had some more slides in here, but let me just find this one. There we go. Okay, so behaviors like Nikki was telling can be an adaptation to childhood trauma. It's not a choice, right? It's just the way the brain works. It's the way we're designed. And then these traumas are stored in the body so they can be re-triggered, and you can have those stress responses to them much later. So we're looking at adaptive behavior in the face of ACEs. If we keep that in mind, we're going to take a much more trauma-informed approach. It's been said before, but I'm going to say it again. When we're working with individuals, the curiosity and the question should not be, or the way we start should not be like, what's wrong with you, right? Never. What's wrong with you? Well, why are you acting like that? Why do you keep doing this even though you know the risk, even though you keep getting in trouble? Like, yep, it's start with what happened to you and show some curiosity and some compassion for that person's trauma history. This approach, if we can become more trauma informed, it can reduce the blame, it can reduce shame, and it can increase the compassion and the interactions that we have with individuals in our community. Okay, so this is just one slide that was from the original studies. It kind of just shows how there can be intergenerational transmission of trauma. So if you think back to those ACEs, one of them was having somebody in the household with substance abuse, right? And so this shows that if you have an increase, all these are the same colors as before, right? From light to dark, your biologic dose of ACEs, the more ACEs, the higher your ACE score, the more likely that you are going to become a person or that individuals will have alcoholism. It's also true, they found in the study, that the higher the biologic dose of adversity in childhood, the higher the likelihood of marrying an alcoholic. So right there you have, there's this intergenerational or the potential for intergenerational trauma in the household. Okay. There's implications, right, for how this is passed or potentially passed down through the families. They also found that higher the ACE score, the higher the depression, and it's a little bit different for women and men, but both are correlated. If they had a higher ACE score, they were more likely to report being depressed. And when you think about depression in the brain, and Nikki and Terry both talked a little bit about the brain function and the pleasure centers of the brain. If you think about depression, some of the ways of adapting to that, I guess, might be to increase drug use, right? Substance abuse, cigarettes and otherwise. There might be increased sexual promiscuity, right? Trying to get that pleasure or to feel better, right? Consuming large quantities of alcohol. So that's why these things cluster together, right? It's not just you one and done. It's like one and higher probability of more. They're held in the body. And so this, there we go. Okay, and so we've looked at, the stress dose, right? The ACE score, and that's along the bottom. And then there's also co-occurring outcomes. So it's not just like you might have, this is again what Dr. Sandy Floody found. It's not just that you might have one health problem, but that you might have many. And so it's associated on the right-hand side. And Nikki's going to go a little bit more into this in the next slide. But just keep in mind that just like it's not one and done with your ACE or with individuals' ACE scores, it's not just one and done with the problems or the struggles that they might be facing health-wise or even just in their social interactions.
Because why, right? That's what we've been talking about. Why? Because we know now, walking away today, we know what the result of an underdeveloped nervous system means. We know what the result of the neurobiological impact means. We know what the result of those extra hormones in our body mean, right? So when we talk about those cortisol levels, I will never forget going to a training and they talked about cortisol is the chemical that tells our body to store fat. That is a survival mechanism. So people who are experiencing obesity and have a complex history of trauma, your body is wired to release more cortisol to help you store more fat because it feels like it needs to help you survive something. So all of the neurobiology piece has a role to play when we talk about these ACE-attributable problems. So not only with the biology, we talk about learned behaviors, right? So I meet with parents and adults all the time to talk about, we only know what we've been taught growing up. So when we talk about all of our role to play, part of that are these concrete supports to help show things can be different. There can be skills, there can be relationships, there can be different environments, right? That's how we get to help out. That's where we get to make a difference. So I'm going to skip this activity, but I'm going to do a different one. Sorry, guys. I'm going to have everybody stand up. It's kind of that time when you move around a little bit anyways. But I like to do this one because it's important for us to kind of understand the neurobiology piece. So if you're at home, stand on up. And we're going to get on our tippy toes and lean forward. And we're gonna stand like this for about 45 seconds. There's no other rules besides trying to stand on your tippy toes, leaning forward for 45 seconds. Y'all are quiet.
Focus.
Okay, go ahead and relax. So that was only 45 seconds I asked you to do that. You may go ahead and sit down. But what was your experience doing that? For 45 seconds, when I asked you to alter your nervous system a little bit, what was your experience? What did you guys experience?
Felt pressure in new places.
Okay. So pressure in new places. I also heard when I said, oh, y'all are quiet, I heard I have to focus on this to be able to do it, right? So you couldn't focus on other things around you or multitask maybe? Anything else you guys kind of took away from that? So thinking about like these outcomes, right? Trying to predict these outcomes, the risks that might happen. So that's something we have to kind of be mindful of too, right? So when people are walking into situations and we know that nervous system is just on high alert constantly, that's what it's like for them. It's hard to process more information around us. We feel a lot of pressure in certain situations. We're thinking ahead. What if I do this? What if I face plant in front of my friends? So that's important for us to be mindful of. So I'd like to talk a little bit about this example of an overloaded car. So if I got my little Buick LeSabre, that was the first car I owned. I got it stuck at a lake party one time. 4 people had to lift it up to move it. Like that's how little it was. But when we talk about individuals, family systems, adults we're working with, our car can easily become overloaded. So individuals who are experiencing poverty, experiencing homelessness, experiencing domestic abuse, maybe sexual abuse, right? Like the more stuff they've got on top of their car isn't going to be able to move. So our responsibility comes in, how can we take some of those pieces, how can we take some of those components off their car for their car to be able to run right? So that's important for us to continue to look at it at that aspect. Individuals aren't able to function when they have a lot of these compound components going on. How can we support providing some concrete components to get some of those components off? So this is a great example when we talk about poverty and homelessness, right? So if I am an individual who's experienced childhood maltreatment, part of my adaptive behaviors are I have a difficulty with focus and cognition. I may be having some external behaviors that make it difficult for me to be successful in the classroom. I might drop out, or I might get kicked out of school. I might be expelled. I might start utilizing substances early. And so that leads to this outcome where we talk about that predisposition for chronic health, for disabilities, for poverty, for homelessness, right? So it's compounded and it really just adds up. So an example would be, there was an adolescent that I worked with. Father died from a heart attack. Single mom, did the best she could, right? She was doing really, really great. High schooler, got to senior year, and he has been failing classes. And we all know COVID's been hard too. So there's a whole other aspect right now where we talk about just COVID as a traumatic experience as well. But so he's failing classes. You've got a few weeks of school left, and I'm like, okay, start bringing your homework to sessions. Let's do it together. And he's like, no, I'm not. I don't think I'm at that point. Okay, then what's our plan? Let's come up with a concrete plan. We talked through this really specific plan. I'm gonna text my grandma, tell my grandma I'm coming these hours, and I'm gonna do my homework at grandma's. So he comes the next week, that didn't happen. So he's still not getting his work done. All right, I think we're at the point to start bringing your homework here. Let's do it together. Nope, I'm not gonna do that. Okay, so what's really going on? Like, level with me. Like, something's going on that's difficult, and I had to kind of really, really build that rapport to drill down with him, right? Well, he had got accepted into the culinary program in Mitchell Tech, and he tells me, he starts to talk about, I don't even think I could drive to Mitchell. I've never driven out of town before. I'm really nervous about even being able to do that. I don't know if culinary school is something that will make me happy, because I don't even have anything that makes me happy. So I'm worried that I'm gonna go invest in this and then I'm gonna hate it, right? So he's self-sabotaging, not passing his classes, so he can't graduate because of the fear of the outcome of what's gonna happen. I'm not able to drive to Mitchell. I'm not able to find an apartment. I don't know if this is the right outcome for me. I don't know if I'm making the right choice. That's an example of some of those adaptations where we talk about that fear of failure, the fear of the pressure of being in new situations is so overwhelming. I'd rather just not do the work so I don't have to be in those uncomfortable situations. All right, Terry, you're up.
So I'm gonna put a bow on some of what Nikki and Darla's been talking about, and I'm gonna hit the pause button to help process anything that you're ruminating on right now before we move into resilience, okay? So ACEs are common, ACEs are highly interrelated. Remember, Darla said 87% of the time when there's one, there's another. 67% of at least people have at least one. These things called ACEs are common and they're interrelated. And ACEs have a cumulative impact that is captured by the ACE score. And people with higher ACE scores are more likely to have multiple health and social problems, some of which increase the odds of their children having ACEs, the epigenetic piece. The discoveries about the effects of toxic stress on the developing brain provide biological plausibility for the ACE study findings. So this information makes a strong case for concluding that relationship between ACE score and health problems is a cause and effect relationship. Our culture has built separate systems and ways of thinking about health and social problems. The way of doing business in society is sometimes called a siloed approach. Each silo has its own budget, training, and mental model about preventing and treating individual types of problems. The ACE study and the related neuroscience findings show us that viewing health and social problems as separate issues is an illusion based on outdated mental models. Now we know that many health and social problems have a common cause, the powerful impact of ACEs through the life course. We used to talk about breaking down silos, but that's not practical because human nature and organizational behavior keep siloed systems well defended. The good news is that none of us have to stop working on the issues we are passionate about. If we simply add a thread to our work that is focused on preventing the accumulation of ACEs, and the common thread will connect and align all of our work in a powerful way. So that's what this oil slick side is essentially showing you. There will be a continued siloed approach, internal, organizational. This is our mission. This is what we focus on. This is what we do. You don't have to change that. Just introduce into your work this thread of understanding ACEs and what it is to build resilience. And as we all collectively, as a community, and all of our parts of this pie deal with different things, we can collectively impact all the entire pie at the same time by understanding ACEs. So this pie chart shows a little bit about the correlation between ACEs and life dissatisfaction. Suicide, 67%. There's not going to be one person in here, if I ask you if you want to prevent suicide, that you're going to say, no, that's not it. You're going to say, yes, I want to help prevent suicide. Well, what do we do when we know that 67% of suicidal ideations and attempts are correlated with their adverse childhood experiences? And are we training ourselves? Are we learning ourselves? Are we equipping ourselves to have the type of conversation that truly impacts these parts of the pond? Marijuana use, anxiety, alcohol, life dissatisfaction, you name it, recidivism, crime. ACEs is correlated, and there's so much data that we have that we didn't even show about that dose response. The higher the ACEs, the higher the likelihood of things like suicide, smoking, depression, obesity. It goes on and on and on and on. You do not have to change what your focus is, what your purpose is. The hope of this information that you would introduce, that you would bring in this information to your organization about understanding ACEs. Another oil slick slide, chronic depression, promiscuity. Darla did such a fantastic job of talking about some of the things that sometimes it's hard to talk about. When you have a teenager that's engaging in sexual promiscuity, and how are we addressing that? How do you speak to her? How do you speak to him about that behavior? Are you really going back into the history and maybe the experiences of things that are causing that behavior? Or is it all fear-based? And if you do this, then this is going to happen. And if you do this, that's going to happen. Where's the compassion in threats? There's no compassion in the threat. Fear is not the only way to get towards change. Also compassion, patience, and incarceration as adults, 61%, suicide attempts, again up there, IV drug use. I enjoy bringing that forward because people just, 78%. If you got this issue going on in your community or people are using drugs, but why? And are we having conversations that help them to mitigate and manage that? And are we also understanding how to build resilience in these individuals? Because if we put shame, blame, and guilt on them, that is not going to help unlock. That's not going to help heal. And we can do that. We can help people to heal. I know oftentimes people hear that hurt people, and that's true. Well, healed people heal people, and healed people help people. Where is the systems and the policies and the approaches towards healing? If we're acknowledging that people have been hurt, if we're acknowledging that people have been harmed, how are we healing? Not with just a punitive approach. I mean, and sentencing them to incarceration only, a punitive practice only, that is not going to heal. We have to ensure that while we have people incarcerated or wherever they are, that there are programs in place for healing. You can't just do time and be healed. Does that make sense? You feel that? Right? This is system reform. And some people don't have the optimism that we can do it, but systems are made up of people. And if we can reach each person, one to another, we can truly have a system that cares. Because institutions provide services, people provide care. Our system is made up of people. And if we can start to connect our minds and our hearts to moving towards compassion and empathy, and in our sphere of influence, our system can help heal people instead of perpetuating hurt. Law and justice, oil slick on the side there, drunk driving, IV drug use, incarceration, which is near and dear to me. Workforce, we have conversations about trauma-informed workplaces. If a person doesn't show up for work, it's not because they don't need the money. Right? Everything takes money. If a person's not showing up, if you have an absenteeism and disengagement, if you have a disengaged coworker, it's not because they're trying to save the ship. Don't care about the workplace. They signed up for the job. They care about the workplace. Something else is happening if you have disengagement. But do you see that? Do you recognize that as a signal to something else that's going on in their life? When you have a disengaged coworker or employee. So we have conversations about what trauma-informed workplaces look like too. Because if we're being honest, ACEs are in this room. Well, it is. I'm in this room, and I work somewhere. And when my employer sees that or recognizes that I have different experiences, and I respond differently to different things. I told my employer back when I worked at a different organization, we were doing reentry services work, and they want me to go back into the prison. Well, you know, tough for me, trigger for me. Does that matter to you as an employer? You're gonna be trauma sensitive to my trigger? Or do you even know what a trigger is? Or are you gonna expect that I do it and then cause a biological response? Not that we can't work through those things. I've worked through many of my triggers, but I'm constantly discovering more of myself and learning more of myself. And it's important that we are doing that for ourselves and our own experiences, because if we're being honest, parental separation and divorce, very common. Mental illness in the home, very common. I shared a story about my experience with neglect. Neglect is the #1 reported maltreatment. The #1 contributor to neglect is overload, not bad parenting. My mother worked 2 jobs to support 6 kids. I was neglected not because she was a bad mom, it's because she was a busy mom. But there's still an impact on me of that neglect, of that lack of availability. And as a parent, me at my worst as a parent has much more to do with my mental, physical, and psychological state than the behavior of that child. So we've got to also be cognizant of how we're supporting parents in these situations as well. How can we take off the load in different ways so that they can be present? And then also give them role models. We are so quick to provide role modeling and resources for children and won't do it for parents because they should have it figured out already. But developmentally may be stunted, may never had the exposure or information. And it is our responsibility, our opportunity to start to provide those things. Adult-based mentorship. Mentorship is not just for children. Mentorship has completely transformed my life in the last 4 years. 31 years old, I'm 35, 36 next month. I didn't get a mentor until I was 31 years old. And my life has been completely transformed because of it. So we've got to see that as well when we're doing this work. Whole family approach, whole life approach, whole person approach in our care, in the workplace, and in that law and justice piece as well. So let's hit the pause button and just answer any questions that you may have about the neuroscience piece, about the ACE piece, or anything that was said, anything that I can address before moving into resilience. Any thoughts, light bulb moments, ahas, circle back on that. Can you go deeper? Brain science piece, neuroscience piece. Sidebar right here. What's happening right there? Can I help?
Well, I'm trying to figure out how we're going to help our kids through everything we've done.
Starts today. What's your name? What's your name?
Tim.
Tim, it starts today. I'll tell you right now, I'll get lost in my story. I tell it a lot, but man, I dropped the ball on parenting for a long time before I got to this better, more empathetic version of me. I'm a father of 3 today. I had my first at 15, 8 days after my 15th birthday. And when I moved him in with me when I was 23 years old and started grad school and became a dad, full physical custody because my mom had it when I was in college, those next 2 years were not good in regards to me being a parent and trying to discipline, trying to coach. It was horrible. As I now knowing what I know now. And it breaks my heart when I learned empathy 5 years ago in a prison in treatment, and I realized how bad of a dad I was to my 8, 9, and 10-year-old when I was 23, 24, and 25. But what didn't I know? How could I be what I never knew, what I never saw? How could I use what I was never taught? I didn't know what empathy was until I was 31 years old, 30 years old in a prison in treatment. So since then, I've apologized to my son 5,000 times. He knows it's sincere. You can't say sorry enough once you realize that you were wrong. Son, I was wrong for the way I responded when you were 8 and 9 years old. And the thing that really got me was this vision of me being a monster. Raising my voice at my child when he's 8 and 9 years old, moving into a new community. As a new kid, having struggles in the classroom, coming home afraid and bullied and all these different things in this community. I was in Vermilion, and I yelled at him as if he was doing something wrong. And when he was struggling academically, I admonished him as an 8-year-old, 9-year-old. I was so disconnected. No empathy. But once I learned what empathy was, I became responsible to being different. So you can't undo what has been done. But today, you can now take this new information and start to have these conversations about how do things change for us. So what are you looking to change?
Well, we were just talking about a lot of time you spend with your shelter.
The overload conversation. Well done. You gotta face it. Not everything you face changes, but nothing changes until you face it. You gotta own it. You guys got part of the responsibility. So any questions though? Any other ahas before we get into resilience?
I thought it was interesting to talk about the intergenerational components of ACEs and how that can manifest throughout, not just you, but people who are going to come after you. I'm just interested to see what your guys' thoughts are about even in those workplace scenarios, as there's defense attorneys and prosecutors. There's judges in this room, how we get to that point of being able to communicate with those people and overcome those barriers, like open ourselves and those individuals, especially the minority population discussion. So that was a really interesting thing to think about too, not just what happened to them, but what's happened in their history and why that can still be relevant, even though I'm not just writing it off as, oh, that happened so long ago. So,
Thank you for that. Your name is?
Jordan.
Thanks, Jordan.
I think one of the interesting things is, sorry, Brian, to put you on the spot again. What's your name?
Jennifer.
Jennifer. So think about like how probably difficult it was when Terry was like, hey guys, what are you talking about? Share with me. And how uncomfortable it probably was just even in this room to be vulnerable with us. And so when we talk about like, how do we help start these conversations or this dialogue about the reality of what's happening, I think we should have to keep going, because for whatever reason, our society has shunned conversations about this for so long. And trauma itself has been a secret people carry. So especially when we talk about sexual abuse, right? People have been taught sexual abuse is a secret you keep. You do not share this with people. So the uncomfort and vulnerability, talking through what's really happened in our family systems, in our homes, we have to just be mindful of that uncomfort and vulnerability around it, and creating safe spaces to really start conversations about what's going on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, please get involved. And so, and that is a part of the healing, is the sharing, right? When it's in the dark, it has power. When it comes to the light, that's when you can start to diminish things away in the light. But there will be no confession without safety. When we train further on what does trauma-informed implementation look like, we learn about the 6 pillars of trauma-informed care, the 10 domains of implementation. The number 1 pillar is safety. You will get 0 confessions from anyone about their adverse childhood experiences if they do not feel safe. 93% of communication is nonverbal. 7% is the words that you say.
And if you don't ask.
And if we don't ask, for sure. But you know how you present yourself, what your body language is saying, what is your tone saying, what is your soul saying? Like, you know, when you look at me, you can tell that I care about you. I care about every single person in you, and you cannot fake authenticity. If you truly care, you can be able to look a person in the eyes and they can feel it, right? But we've got to get there. We've got to be that comfortable with our own emotions to be able to do that. We got to be having conversations about our emotions to be able to do that. You are unable to be empathetic with others until you are in tune with your own emotions and self-awareness. So if you have a struggle with connecting emotionally with other people, it's more of an indicator of the work that you still need to do in you. With being comfortable with sadness or joy, anger or fear. And it's so imperative that we're doing that work to be trauma-informed. Because once you start to get that type of information in these interactions, can you hold that space safely for them? There is no judgment in it. This is a human condition. These are common conditions. And we got to be able to have that demeanor in our 93% that they know that they are safe when they're interacting with you. And so we've got resources and stuff. I imagine we're going to send them out. We got all types of ways that language can shift. As a judge, as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney, that language, there's an opportunity for that language to shift.
They're in everybody's package.
There's in everybody's package. And it's imperative, it's wonderful. We're so grateful for the momentum that is happening within our circuit, our judicial circuit, to do this work of looking at language, of looking at physical environments. Safety in all its forms, that's emotional, that's physical, that's psychological, safety. And we're going to be addressing all those things. One more opportunity for any other questions, comments, ahas, before we move into that resilience piece. Yep.
How do you encourage people that might,
Oh, it's over there.
how do you encourage people that might be,
It's over there.
like on a path and doing well, and then they're reasonable, every day go to work, and they might simply are working on, you can obviously work on yourself, change yourself, a lot easier than somebody else. Change yourself. How do you encourage people to just keep, not to give up? I mean, I get it every day, just one thing after another, keep happening to them. The second thing is a little bit of progress, and it's no fault of their own. Something happens, and it's like,
Sure. What's your name? Hi, Nicole. So a couple of things I think of. One is being that person that continues to believe in them with them. Right? It takes one caring and competent adult to keep a person's hope alive. The whole world can be in a handbag going to hell. And if you're the one person that's like, you got what it takes, you can keep doing it, just hang in there, be that person. Right? So you're already doing that. You're already helping to build that resilience in that person from being that person, helping them to have a positive self-view of themselves. Be that, do that, keep doing that, super affirming. The other thing you want to do with work with people is help them to develop boundaries. Like if this environment is no good, like listen, if my employer is not going to be trauma responsive, then they're going to lose an employee. If my current partner is not going to be trauma, then they're going to lose a partner. I got family members I got boundaries with because of the triggers. So you're gonna have a conversation about boundaries and triggers and what's good for my health. Like when I coach people on health and wellness. Right? Is this good for your health, that environment? And if it's not, that environment's not changing, that environment's not conducive to wellness, then let's start making a plan to get you in a different environment.
I think that's probably a large problem with employers. A lot of us bring any career.
And that's why we do this work of community education. That employers, that supervisors, that husbands and wives, aunts and uncles would just realize that there's an opportunity to be trauma informed in all that we're doing. And if and when we are not, we're not being inclusive.
I know when I say this, Terry's gonna go, yeah, because he talks about it so many times. But when we help people learn that the impact of trauma is not their fault, when we help shift, right? Like, when we experience trauma, it is normal to internalize, like, this happened because I did something wrong. This happened because I wasn't good enough. Like this internal shame tape that occurs, or what's the point because it's going to continue to happen to me. When we help people learn about ACEs and neurobiology and resilience, that is also huge in giving people who have been impacted the shift of, there is hope for me. So, so I agree with the relationships. I agree with boundaries to help, people reach their potential. But that awareness piece of their own trauma and the neurobiology component and that resilience is absolutely capable for everybody is monumental.
Woo, true that. I have so many stories of how much things start making sense to me after learning about ACEs and different behaviors that I did and do and have undone. I got so many stories that you'll just chuckle, you'll just laugh. And I realized that it was just an adaptive behavior and it had nothing to do with the person who triggered me. It's just what the trigger did to me. It caused me to behave in a certain type of way. I'll give you a short one. I just didn't like questions. It felt like an interrogation. So I had a girlfriend a few relationships ago, and I used to respond like she was like the federal government because it was just questions. And questions feel like interrogation. And all of a sudden, I feel like if you're asking me questions, there's a chance that I might be arrested and thrown in jail. This is a person who loves me and just wonders about my well-being. But questions makes me feel triggers interrogation. And in my mind, I can't answer these questions. Or well, I can end up in jail or prison. And when I realized, as I was learning about ACEs, undoing that, like help someone, people were helping me. I still get help. I have coaches and friends and like help me undo that. Just because a person asks a question doesn't mean it's an interrogation. And certainly if they're not even a law enforcement officer, there's a disconnect between what you're experiencing and what's happening. Undoing that. Yeah, another story I often share is when I move into a new neighborhood, I find so many ways in and out of to get to my house. I just was I would find 8 ways to my house and 8 ways from my house because in my neighborhood, going to a new neighborhood, you needed multiple escape routes. Just in case something happened, you just needed to know how to get away. You needed those escape routes. And I didn't realize I was doing it until I was learning about ACEs, starting to assess some of my behaviors. And that was one of my behaviors, that I would move to a new house and I go this way for a while. And I'm like, well, what's another way I can get here? I never thought about why I was doing that. But growing up, I needed multiple escape and 2 routes to get to and from school. Growing up in neighborhoods where gangs were happening, and I didn't, I just remember being 8 years old, looking out a window, afraid. How am I going to get home? This gang is outside. They want to whatever. How can I go find different ways to get home? So here I am at 30-something years old, finding different ways still to get to my home, not realizing that I wired that behavior as a boy, growing up in those environments. So this often happens where we cover so much information that resilience gets tight. And so then we're often invited back so we can go deeper into resilience. So I don't know if we're over time, if I just try to give you a bite size, or we just got to come back.
Yeah, you got 10 minutes.
I got 10 minutes, okay? I can give you a sum of what resilience is and to really help to see how do we move forward, right? So again, when I talked about who I am today, and you guys can sense it now, like I'm a very transparent vessel. You know, that we would have a hope in what we can accomplish with people who came from similar backgrounds and stories like my own, who have these adverse childhood experiences. And one of the things we want to do with individuals is help them to build resilience. So I look at the word resilience similarly to like entrepreneurship and diversity and trauma, where people know the word, but they don't know the layers. Like, be resilient. Well, what does that mean? Right? And there's just so many layers to entrepreneurship. There's so many layers to diversity. So there's science to resilience. So the three core protective systems when it comes to resilience is individual capabilities, attachment and belonging, and then community, cultural, and spiritual practices. These are the things that we're working to build and develop as we help build resilient people and resilient communities. So the first one is individual capabilities, and it starts with helping a person have a positive self-view, right? The self-talk, right? You gotta confront and take away people's commitment or habit of beating themselves up. Like, I'm stupid, I'm dumb, I'm not worth it. Any type of statement that comes out of a person's mouth that is not positive about themselves, we have the opportunity to confront that and correct it and tell them that that's not true. Individual capability starts with a positive self-view. And then as we help people to develop positive language over themselves, using mantra, using affirmation, their thoughts begin to shift and change. But that's the first part of individual capabilities, is how am I viewing myself? Do I see myself as worthy? Do I see myself as valuable? Right? No, people, you gotta just tell people, you are worth it. You are worth my time. It is not a burden. You have value. Here's all the people that matter to you. And you help them to see how they matter in the world. The second part of individual capabilities is called self-efficacy. And it's the belief that what I do influences what happens to me. So a lot of people will say that everything in life happens for a reason. That's true if you choose to believe that. But I also remind people that the choices that I make is the reason that everything happens in life. Life is not just happening to me. I am happening to life with and through my choices. And we can help people to develop self-efficacy by providing opportunities for them to contribute, for them to have an impact on things. If we are doing everything for people, we are not helping them to build self-efficacy. We want to invite people into opportunities to do stuff with us. So if that's in the classroom, when you're working with kiddos and they have different tasks they can do around the classroom, that's helping to build self-efficacy. Or even with adolescents and adults, what are you inviting people to help you with, so that they can see that they can influence life around them and things aren't just handed out. Not that you don't give people stuff, not that you don't help people with establishing security and crisis care when they need it, but not completely. And realizing that by building self-efficacy, how we do that is by presenting opportunities for them to contribute. That's a part of individual capabilities. And then the third component is called self-regulation. And that is the ability to gauge our state of mind and emotions and keep them under control while we navigate social situations.
To get that, put it down on our brain. So bringing that frontal cortex back into play.
Yep. And I love what Darla and Nikki have been doing the brain model. And one thing to know about that top brain is that's where logic and empathy is. So once that lid is flipped and they're offline, there's no logic, there's no empathy. You're not going to try to, you can't try to make things make sense when the lid's off. There's no logic. If a person is explosive and they are now in a midbrain, they're not thinking consequence, they're not thinking ripple effect. You've got to help them to regulate. So self-regulation is a part of individual capabilities as well. There's so many ways to help with regulation, breathing, mindfulness, yoga, exercise, music I use. And anytime you go into new environments, you're going to feel that energy come in your body, and then you practice your own regulation to mellow yourself out. We got to teach that same ability to people. One thing I do in my after school program now, I got a high school after school program, and I tell people, you can't introduce any of this stuff too early. There's no such thing as having a conversation about emotional intelligence and empathy too soon. Neither is self-regulation. Teach self-regulation as, it's amazing. My 8-year-old is learning that in her elementary school. And I'm grateful for that, because now as an educator, I've got something that I can connect with her to. And Leilani, you flipped your lid, didn't you? Because we had that happen a couple of days ago. You know? So I'm grateful for that. So the first thing is individual capabilities. The second part of resilience is called attachment and belonging. A protective system where we can nurture its belonging. Giving people a place to associate. Giving people a place to identify. Giving people a place where there are others like them, and there's people who care about them. There's all type of associations, not just like peer group association, but like athletic associations and soccer teams and churches and all different types of things that if you get a person attached to something, if you help a person find a place of belonging, they will develop resilience in those environments. This is why athletics and things are so important. It's great to get your kids in athletics. I was saved by this type of environment, not knowing that it was doing it for me, but being an athlete and having that camaraderie, having that brotherhood, having that coach, having a place to attach and belong, especially when isolation and you have these thoughts of I don't belong. How can we as professionals find places where people belong so that they can get that esteem, that confidence, that work? This is the work of the work that we're doing, is knowing the resources that are out there. We're creating the spaces and places. But and then there's places and spaces that are there, but we aren't just recognizing that they're a part of this resilience thing, and a big part of this resilience thing. Those AA communities, those NA communities, all that, if it's helping to build resilience. But make it more than just about going to achieve your sobriety. Start talking to people about building resilience and how being attaching to things and belonging to things will help to contribute to that. And so
Brandy does drug core yoga. If
Nice.
you guys aren't familiar with her program at all. And so at American Behavioral Health, we have started providing the space for that, and listening to the individuals who attend and talk about that community that they have formed, and showing up every week has been huge. So that's a great example of something that's already going on in Brookings County.
loving it. So many places to attach, so many places to belong, community, faith, and cultural processes, understanding that we are all different and that's what makes us the same. That's good, I just came up with it. We're all different and that's what makes us the same, right? Different in our culture, different in our faith, different in our beliefs, but we've got to embrace all of that. We've got to be open to all of that, because that's a big part of who I am. It's my culture. It's a big part of who I am. It's my faith. It's a big part of who you are. Your culture, your faith, your family culture, your family faith, all those different things. And how are we truly accepting of all of that diversity when it comes to the people we're interacting with? This is going to help to build resilience. Not too much time to go deep into community capacity and development, but you'll see leadership expansion, coming together, shared learning, and results-oriented decision-making. Some of this information talks about how high-capacity communities use these things on repeat, iterative process of leadership expansion, coming together around a line, a goal, understanding ACES, sharing and learning, bringing people along with you to learn with you, and results-oriented decision-making, and really moving towards empowerment, really moving towards using credible messaging, bringing people to the table to contribute to the solutions, not just us, all of us, right? No us, them, it's everybody coming to the table to help build community capacity And Brookings is an example of that happening, right? The resilient community whole dealio, it's a big deal. Keep that up. Keep this up. It does not stop here. This is that we continue to have this conversation so we can be comfortable as professionals, having it, training on it, engaging it, understanding ACEs, building resilience through positive self-view, self-efficacy, teaching regulation, doing it ourselves. It does start with each one of you having your own health and wellness in a good space.
And so when Terry talks about that, we know it's noon, so we want to be mindful of your time. Darla, myself, we can do the ACES training, we can do resiliency specific training. For any entity, we can bring that to your organization. We can also do community ones. So when we talk a little bit about how do we help the individuals we work with understand more about the impacts of trauma, we have lots of opportunities that we can come alongside you guys and work with you however you feel is powerful from when you walk away today.
Change is up to us. Everything that happened yesterday can't be undone, but we can start today with a new commitment to bringing understanding ACEs as a thread. You still focus on what you focus on, but the goal is to bring this understanding ACEs in as a thread that connects all of us collectively to move people towards healing and building resilience.
And Terry's always empowered me. He's done such a good job of sharing his own story. One takeaway is, when we learn about ACEs and the reality of one experience that is your 1A score, my personal ACE score is 7. So I've experienced 7 out of 10 types of childhood maltreatment. One of the most impactful individuals in my life was actually my school resource officer. And so just like we talked about today, those concrete supports, those caring relationships can definitely make an impact. I'm married, I have kids, I have a master's degree, I have a career, I have a house. I'm very successful when it comes to the outcomes associated with it. So always remembering that is not your story. Individuals who've experienced trauma are not broken.
Woo! Resilient. We are.
So thanks for being here today, you guys.
Thanks, Tony.
Just a couple of things. First off, the Zoom audience said thank you as well. You got some applause from them. I did want to say in your packets, one of the pieces of information that was provided was this article, Making the Case for ACEs. I think it's a really good article. The first paragraph, very powerful. I just wanted to read a portion of that. It says, currently we're in the midst of a crisis which affects our most vulnerable population. Cutting it short, that's ACEs. And it's affecting our children, and as it affects them, it affects all of us. And I like the last part of that is, its cure is not dependent on scientists working at warp speed. Rather, it is dependent on the willingness of judges, lawyers, mental health professionals, doctors, mediators, social workers, and legislators to come together in the active, coordinated prioritization of the best interests of our children. And that's what you all have done here today, just being here and learning about this stuff. I want to thank you for attending, because this is important stuff, and it means a lot that you would show out for this event here. For those of you who came up to Brookings, we appreciate you taking the trip. And then for those of you who are local, we appreciate you taking the time to be here. So thank you, everybody. We're going to shut the Zoom off. Thank you to our presenters, Terry, Nikki, and Darla. Really proud of this event. Glad you guys could come out for it. Thank you.